Okay, so my name's Nick Phipps and I'll be doing a presentation today on Metroid. So I'll be covering a lot of the Metroid series right from the very beginning, the first Metroid on the NES, and I'll be going all the way through up to Metroid Prime, where they brought it into the 3D realm. So it'll cover a lot of information and hopefully we get something out of it. So just to start off with, the designers that worked on the 3D one, which is the primary one that I'll be talking about, were Mike Wicken, Mark Piscini and Carl Deckard. Those were the American guys. So there was two studios. There was the Nintendo crew and then the guys at Retro who worked on the art side of it. So I'll get into that a little bit more. We had two artists that were the primary inspiration for the art style in Metroid Prime, and we had two guys working on different aspects of the music as well. So those two guys there. So yeah, we'll get into that later on as we get through it. So I'll be covering mainly about the controls and fairly heavily on the art style and the 3D aspects of Metroid. And there's a couple of influences there. Mainly the Metroid series from the very beginning all the way through to the Prime series that started in 2001. So this here's a bit of a timeline of how all the Metroid series kind of lay out relative to each other, and just the Prime one, wait, where's it gone? Yeah, just here. It's the one that we'll be focusing on here. So it kind of fits in just after the second Metroid happens. And it kind of slots in the middle there. Alrighty. So from the original Metroids, we'll be looking at, there's three of them. They all follow a very similar design. So we've got Metroid, the original one on the Nintendo Entertainment System. Then we've got Metroid, The Return of Samus on the Game Boy. And the third one is Super Metroid. These are the precursors to the Metroid Prime. And they were all directed by Gunpei Yokoi. And by the time they got to Super Metroid, Yoshio Sakamoto took over as the director, and Gunpei stepped up to being a producer and took a higher level role in the design process. The art styles for these games was heavily influenced by the Aliens movies from Aliens 1 in '79, and Aliens movies were H.R. Geiger's art style. The Aliens movies also heavily influenced the story in Metroid. The story in Metroid's fairly vague and is entirely given through action. So there's no text, or virtually no text. In the early ones specifically, you get a couple of lines of text at the start of the game and that's it. The rest is you play through and do stuff, and through that they tell the story. In Metroid, music was a really interesting one. So there's two composers who worked on this, Hip Tanaka and Kenji Yamamoto.
Great name.
It is an awesome name. And Hip Tanaka will talk about fairly in depth because his influence on the original Metroids was really quite prominent, and he had a really interesting way of going about his composing. And so we'll get to that in a minute. First off, Gunpei Yokoi, the man himself. This guy, he is the father of pretty much game consoles as we know them today. He was one of the primary designers on the NES, the Nintendo Entertainment System, or the Famicom in Japan. He also designed the Game Boy and the directional pad, or the D-pad, that we use in modern games. Just about every console uses it these days. He was an absolute genius, and he probably doesn't get as much recognition as he should get. So yeah, he originally started off with Nintendo working as a mechanical engineer back before Nintendo started doing any game consoles, before they were in toys even. They were purely making Hanafuda cards, and so he was put in charge of making sure that the machines that built the cards were able to do their job. So he was just a repairman pretty much. And from there, the Hanafuda cards were kind of in a decline. Nintendo was looking for something else to do, some way to make some more money, so they decided to move into making toys. And so Yokoi was kind of a bit of a handyman. Around the workshops, everyone knew him as tinkering with stuff, and in his spare time he'd make little toys. And on the first day they started up their toy division, he was asked, all right, can you give us a toy? The next day he walked into work and handed over what became known as the Ultra Claw. And the Ultra Claw then went on to sell millions, and he made that in one day. It was just something that he'd been tinkering with in his spare time.
What was the Ultra Claw?
I'll see if I can pull one up for you. I don't actually have one in my slides here.
So it's sort of like that.
But yeah, if you've ever seen any of those scissor things, the Ultra Claw started those. So let's see if we can find one. Yeah, this here is the Ultra Claw. The Ultra Hand, I'm sorry. So this shows up in games like the WarioWare games. It just kind of pops up every now and then as a little joke for Nintendo. They kind of liked it. So yeah, this sold ridiculously. And it was in 66, sorry. Yeah? No, they used it throughout WarioWare when they have like mini games. Every now and then it'll pop up as a little joke throughout some of Nintendo's stuff. They have a bit of a habit of throwing little Easter eggs around the place. So yeah, and Yokoi, one of his main games was the Metroid series. As I said, he went through Metroid 2 on the Game Boy, because he designed the Game Boy solely, so that was kind of his little baby, and also through Super Metroid. He then left Nintendo, and a year later he died in a tragic car accident, which has a lot of speculation around it, because there's a whole bunch of conspiracy theories that because he left Nintendo to create his own company and started making a similar item to the Game Boy, not the same, so he made the Wonder Swan for Bundo.
Oh,
and
really?
He designed the Wonder Swan, and in that there's a lot of conspiracy that Nintendo, with its ties to the Yakuza, had him taken out after he
hired
left.
Miyamoto to kill his master.
So he died in a car accident on one of the Japanese highways. Incident. Alright, so just before we get started, I'll play a bit of a video here for, and this is just someone else doing something similar to what I'm doing, and I'll only play through part of it because he touches on things that I want to talk about later. What is it called?
Isn't that actually the video then?
Power-ups. Yeah, that one doesn't play. So yeah, this guy's voice is probably a little annoying.
In the middle of the 1980s, Nintendo was on top of the world. After releasing their popular Famicom console in their native Japan, they released it in America as the Nintendo Entertainment System, the console that single-handedly reversed the video game crash in 1983. And then one of their designers, Shigeru Miyamoto, turned into a rock star by developing smash hits like Super Mario and The Legend of Zelda. In many ways, Miyamoto stole the thunder from Nintendo's former Golden Boys, the guys of their first research and development division, cleverly named R&D1. So as
Yes,
the
these
corporate
guys have
executives tasked
good
Miyamoto
naming.
with continuing his Italian pony job, it became R&D1's duty to create new franchises. Division leader Gunpei Yokoi, who had been Miyamoto's producer, wanted to prove R&D1's worth again. He set out to make a game that would take a number of cues from his protege's games, but at the same time would strike out into bold new territory rumor dared not tread. The result was the start of one of the most famously cursed franchises in gaming history, a series that routinely produced some of the most beloved games of all time, and yet never saw commercial success. But backtracking through 25 years of Metroid maps reveals a wealth of daring innovation, one of the greatest comebacks in the industry's history, and some of the greatest 2D and 3D experiences ever played.
Yes, these guys have an awesome series. They do whole bunch of games under this series.
Looking out at the gaming landscape of the mid-80s, Yokoi saw that there were a lot
Can
of
you turn it
different
up a little
design
bit?
ideas
Yeah.
emerging. His protege, Miyamoto, had made platforming popular with his Mario series, and non-linear exploration popular with his Zelda series. Meanwhile, in the West, arcade shooters like Commando were just starting to become popular. Yokoi decided that he would combine all of these disparate elements into one game, a non-linear shooter platformer. On top of this, he also wanted to go where Miyamoto hadn't dared. The Nintendo rockstar was a child at heart, and his games were correspondingly lighthearted. Yokoi's game, by contrast, would be a dark, moody piece that took its cues from Ridley Scott's Alien, just about the opposite of a kid's movie. It's no coincidence that one of the famous bosses in the game is named Ridley. Under the direction of Yoshio Sakamoto, the game would feature a darker color set, a claustrophobic space, and a distinct sense of isolation throughout. Where Mario had Luigi, this hero would be alone with his enemies for the entire journey. It was one of the earliest games that specifically tried to appeal to an older audience. The hero would be interstellar bounty hunter Samus, and his game was to be called Space Hunter. But as the development progressed, the crew started getting more creative with their names. First up, a soccer fan on the team gave Samus the last name Aaron, after the middle name of soccer legend Pele, Arantes. Next, the title itself got an overhaul. Director Sakamoto realized that the hero's rapid movement through underground spaces was kind of like taking the city metro, and that his power armor looked kind of like an android. Crunching Metro and Android together, and he got a word that he thought was pretty cool. Metroid. The name stuck. Ironically, while this word was made to describe the hero, it would eventually become the name of the hero's enemy. The story was relatively bare bones, but was just enough to give the gameplay a cool context. Bounty hunter Samus has discovered that the evil space pirates have set up a secret base underneath a deserted planet, where they are growing an army of Metroids, evil creatures that are just plain bad news. It's up to our hero to save the day. But to do it, Samus would have to break well-established gaming conventions. Like other characters of the time, Samus could run to the right, but to gamers' surprise, he could also run back to the left. Metroid was one of the first games to ever allow backtracking. Yokoi, Sakamoto, and their team took this simple mechanic and designed an entirely new genre of gaming around it. Where other games had the player run through a linear level to its end, the entire Metroid game would all be one giant map that could be traversed at will. The trick was that certain regions would be inaccessible until Samus found a specific power-up for his armor. This meant the player would constantly be moving back and forth, up and down across the map, searching for new items to reach new areas. It was so huge, in fact, that players wouldn't be able to beat it in one sitting. So the crew made use of a radical new system, pioneered by Zelda just a few months earlier, allowing the player to save his progress. Now it wouldn't matter if the player had to go do something else. He could come back to the game at any time. It took the non-linear...
Alright, we'll just pause that one there because he then touches on a bunch of stuff that I'm going to go into in a little more depth later on. So as was mentioned in the video there, the Metroid system revolves around the fact of collecting items to then progress through the map. Each Metroid has progressively added an item onto the list, or a couple of items, and reused old items from the previous games. So this list here is the first Metroid. So you've got a fairly small list of items that you collect throughout the series. starting off with Morph Ball in the same room that you spawn off, and then progressing through till the final boss, and you should pretty much have all of those by the time you go to the final boss.
Did they remove the long beam?
Yeah, Long Beam was then replaced by the Charge Beam when they got into Super Metroid, because the distance was a requirement on the system. The earlier systems couldn't handle too much stuff on the screen, and so they didn't have and the later systems didn't have that problem, so they felt it wasn't necessary. So yeah, you've got the original Metroid, then the Metroid on the Game Boy. This one here has the note of the Spider Ball, which didn't turn up in the Super Metroid on the Super Nintendo, but it then reappears back in Metroid Prime, where they were able to integrate it back into the system.
What's the Spider Ball?
Spider Ball
Climbs
is
up walls.
the morph ball that can climb up walls. So I'll touch on that a little bit as well later on. So yeah, the system has stayed the same. The only thing that's been removed over the course of it is the long beam, which was replaced by the charge beam, but all of those items are still in the Prime series. And yeah, Prime series added a new suit and a new weapon, and that was it. They still used all the rest of the weapons from the previous games. So through this, the Prime series is working on the blueprint created by Yokoi and his team in the R&D1 team at Nintendo. So from this, the actual Autoship part on Nintendo's side is all created all the way through, so it's stayed the same through the whole process. And even here in Metroid Prime, sorry, I didn't actually label them up the top because they were a little long. But yeah, even in Metroid Prime, in the final one, this was created after Yokoi had died, but Shigeru Miyamoto took over in Yokoi's place and carried on his legacy. And Shigeru was trained by Yokoi from the very start. They worked on the early Mario Brothers and Donkey Kong games on the arcade machines. So yeah, it's still Yokoi carrying through this. Also, Yoshio Sakamoto was a guiding influence. He didn't actually participate in the design process. He just was kind of like an outside resource that popped in every now and then and just made sure things were following along the lines that they should have according to the early games. So I've kind of touched on these a little bit, but these are the items. So you've got Marumaru, or the Morph Ball, and then the items that are directly associated with that. So the Spider Ball, which, as I mentioned before, only appeared in the Game Boy version, The Return of Samus, and the Jump Ball, and the Bomb and Super Power Bomb. Sorry. Then you've got the suit upgrades, the Energy Tank and the Reserve Tank, which are general things that keep appearing time and time again in every Metroid game. Speed Boost. The Speed Boost was actually altered when it went into the Metroid Prime series, because they felt it was too fast for the players to control, to have Samus running really fast through the level. Speed Boost just makes you run faster. And so after you run for a little bit, it would accelerate like ×2 speed sort of thing, and it would run through walls and that sort of stuff. So what they did with the Speed Boost is they replaced it with the Boost Ball. So when you're in a Morph Ball, you can actually boost. And one of the designers used this to design a core element of the Metroid game, of the Metroid Prime game. And so replacing the Speed Booster, which was a run system, with a ball booster. And I'll talk about how that's implemented later. Then you've got the high jump boots, which just allow for a second jump. X-ray scope. This one's a really interesting one, because the X-ray scope really played a primary part in part of the design for Metroid Prime. because in the Metroid Prime one, they really wanted to go from a side-scrolling shooter to a first-person shooter, but they still wanted to have the feel that you're playing as Samus, and Samus is a really iconic figurehead in the game system. And so they were really trying to and ah about how to create Samus and the feeling that you're playing as Samus while you're in first-person view. And so this was one of the really difficult things that they faced. And the X-ray scope was one thing that integrated into creating the scan visor system, which creates a GUI around the player's screen that gives you the feel of being inside the helmet of the power suit, and that attributed and also built up the feel of being Samus, even though you can't see it or feel the player, like the actual character. And we'll touch on that a bit more as well. And the screw attack and space jump, these were all elements that are still in the games today. Gravity suit and the Varia suit are both just power-ups. One allows you to walk underwater and one allows you to take less damage from heat elements. These have all stayed the same throughout the system, all the way from Super Metroid. They've added to these and kind of tweaked how they function within the game, but they are all relatively the same. And I'll touch on the grapple a little bit as well in a sec. These are the two new elements that were added to the Metroid Prime series, which were not in any of the others. So the Phazon suit plays with the element Phazon, which is on Talon 4, where Metroid Prime takes place, and also the Phazon gun with the Phazon suit. The Phazon gun actually is the same as the Hyper Beam that you acquire in Super Metroid, but the Hyper Beam is only used against the final boss. Same with the Phazon gun. There's only one instance where you can use it, and it's used to defeat the final boss. The scan visor, as I mentioned before, gives you the feeling of being inside the power suit and being Samus, while not actually being able to see the avatar character. It also is used to give the player information about the world, so you can scan just about any item inside the world and it gives you like a little bit of information. If you scan enemies, it gives you information about weak spots, so this enemy, hit them from behind and you'll do more damage, that sort of stuff. That was also created as a collectible, so if you went through the game, you would get a score of how many items you collected, how many items you scanned. This was because of the difference between the Japanese market and the American market. So I'll touch on that when I get around to that. So as I mentioned before, this is the Spider Ball, which in Return of Samus, which was still in the side-scroller, allowed you to just climb up all the walls. But in the 3D world, you couldn't just allow the character to crawl over any wall because it kind of breaks the puzzles and stuff. So they made these magnetic rails, and so the player can actually attach themselves to the magnetic rails and use the Spider Ball to crawl up walls, along roofs, etc. Alrighty, on to music. This is still in the original Metroids. Hip Tanaka, actually, when all of the really, when the processors for consoles became more powerful and were able to control more than just your 8-bit sounds and this sort of stuff, it created more freedom for people to start going crazy. And it created a rivalry between the composers to create better and more different sounds. And so through this rivalry, Hip Tanaka actually decided that he would try and create a sound that didn't have a melody, which is very difficult. And I'll play you some of his music later on, and I'll point out how this really affects the music. Alrighty, multiple endings. Metroid was the first game, as far as all my research can show, that gave the player multiple endings. This also started up the post-credit Easter eggs, so to speak, which Roger Ebert describes as the monk's reward, because you have to sit through the entire credits before you see anything. So this is seen in a lot of modern movies, so like Pirates of the Caribbean, when you sit at Avengers, when you sit through the entire movie, just after the credits, just before, there's that one little scene. And so Metroid started this by revealing, so as you heard in the previous video, they were referencing Samus as a he. This was done throughout the entire promotional for the original Metroid, to keep the secret that Samus was a female character secret.
Awesome.
It was more prominent in the American release of the advertisements and that sort of stuff, because in the Japanese language they were able to use a non-gender specific word for it, and so they were able to do it without specifying whether it was a male or a female. But in the American release they used he, because it was considered the norm. And then at the end of the game, if you achieved higher than, I believe it was 75% on your item collection, Samus would take off her helmet and reveal that she was a woman. If you got above 90 or 95, she would be in a bathing suit. And if you got 100% and beat it in under a specific time limit, you would get her in a bikini. And this was apparently a really big inspiration for people to replay the game, because apparently bathing suits are
In 8-bit.
in 8-bit. So as you can see, they're really, really provocative there. Also, just going back to this, there, with the password system in the original Metroid, there was a password that you could type in called Justin Bailey, so you would type in the words Justin Bailey, and this would start you with all the weapons, and Samus would be in a bathing suit running around shooting stuff. So just some little side notes. So onto the story for the original Metroids. It's very heavily influenced by the storylines from Alien, the original movie. So things like the appearance of a boss called Ridley, as a reference to Ridley Scott, the creator of Alien, and also things like the big boss at the end of Metroid being called Mother Brain, in a reference to the computer inside of the ship in Alien being Mother. Also Samus being a female character, being alone. These are all elements taken from the Alien series. And even to the point where Samus does things very similar to what Ripley does within the Aliens movies. This scene here, which is the final scene in Metroid 2, is what Sakamoto actually references it as one of the most influential scenes on him. And from this scene, he will forever picture Samus as the badass bounty hunter who didn't shoot the baby. So that's the big emotional thing, and as the director of the game, that was his big moment, and he references that as a really influential aspect of the game. On to H.R. Geiger. Well, this guy seems to have influenced everything, but yeah, he's quite a character.
It's pretty
So in his artwork, he's got a lot of biomechanical stuff, and this influenced fairly heavily on the artists that did the concepts for Metroid Prime. So here we can see the spines and all this sort of the biomechanical, like the metal, but still having kind of a skeletal shape. And so this is one of the images from Metroid Prime. You can sort of see that biomechanical objects in the background there, and also some concept art by Android Jones there on the side. So yeah, this is Lilith, and also the classic Necronine, which is what the alien was designed from, kind of filters through and is seen in various places throughout the Metroid creature design. Alrighty, so now let's get on to Metroid Prime. So now, from the previous games, Metroid had a fairly in-depth and large fan base, and so it was fairly important that the Metroid Prime series didn't disappoint the fan base, because the early Metroids, I didn't mention this, but the first one was designed for the Nintendo CD system. So in Japan, it was only released on the CD, Nintendo CD, which was a peripheral for the NES. And because of that, it didn't sell in Japan. And only when it got to America, when it was released on the NES, not the Famicom, did it finally start selling. So it was very close to cancelling the entire thing. So yeah, and the cocktail, when you ask for a Metroid, what do you get?
If anyone hasn't seen that website, they should check it out. It's amazing.
Yeah.
Like, the drunken miracle.
Alrighty, so I'm gonna play the US commercial that they did for Metroid.
The cold silence of space only punctuates the feeling of death that emanates from this virtually lifeless planet. Only one thing is alive and well here. Evil. And it must be destroyed, decimated, exterminated. But first, it must be found. Rated T for teen.
So yeah, that was what they sold sold Metroid Prime with, the promotional materials that they used. And the significance behind that is that they were targeting a more mature audience, as mentioned in the previous video. And so the use of a live action actor, so a live action sort of skit for the ads, was fairly influential to make it feel realistic, to target that more hardcore, mature audience that they were after. Alrighty, so the reception that Metroid Prime received was some of the best known. It was the second best selling game on the GameCube for the year that it was released. It came second only to the Super Smash Bros. Out at the time, and it sold the most units out of the entire Metroid series, even the current ones. So the Metroid trilogy, it sold higher than the two ones that succeeded it. On the first week, it sold 250,000 units, and it got a Metacritic score of 97. So out of 78 critics, the average score was 97. So a majority of them actually gave it 100% score in their analysis. It's also regarded as one of the best games for the GameCube, or the best, depending on who you talk to. So yeah, the design of Metroid Prime was a real clash of the Eastern world versus the Western world. And in Eastern, I'm talking fairly specifically about Japan, because of the Japanese design team from Nintendo. And West, when I talk about West, I'm talking about America. Specifically, it also influences what we know as the Western world. So both the Western world and the Japanese market have very different aspects of what they consider to be good gameplay and what they are looking for in a game. And this was really prominent when they were designing Metroid, because the Japanese team would design one thing and the American team would design something completely different, and they would both go, this is what's going to sell in our market. And so what they did was they took both of the strengths from the Japanese and the Western and combined it in to make Metroid Prime. One of the key things that the Western market was well known for at the time is creating really polished and pretty looking gameplay. So they pretty much allowed retro studios to do their own thing, as long as it aligned up with the vision from the previous Metroid games and the vision of Gunpei Yokoi. Then they were pretty much given free rein to just create something pretty. And Nintendo did a lot of the core gameplay elements. So every time, Retro was actually building the games, but the design aspects of those elements were done by Shigeru Miyamoto and a lot of the R&D1 team, which had then transferred to EDA, which is just another department in the Nintendo hierarchy. So yeah, we've got both the graphic elements of the Western world and the gameplay elements of the Eastern world combined into one game. Now there's an interesting story in the design process of one day where Shigeru came into the design meeting and they were trying to figure out how to get the feel of Samus. And as I mentioned before with the visors, Shigeru walked in and said, there's something missing. What if Samus had a bug's head? And the guys at Retro walked out going, what the fuck? They were just like, Samus has a bug's head? And so they went off and conceptualized images of Samus wearing a bug's helmet and wearing all this weird stuff. And after a little bit of kind of mulling over the idea, they went, he's not actually talking about visuals, he's talking about perception. What if she saw through different eyes? What if she had the ability to see through walls, or to see elements that aren't there, or to see in a different way? And from this they produced the visor system and implemented the X-ray vision, the X-ray scope from the previous games through that system. So Retro's history itself is quite a bumpy one. Retro started out as a new studio. They hadn't released a successful game prior to getting the Metroid project. They had 4 games running. They were a brand new studio with 4 teams running. And I believe, 120 employees trying to produce 4 games. And the story goes that Shigeru Miyamoto and Satoru Iwata came to the studio. Satoru Iwata is now Nintendo's president. At the time, he was still just one of the workers at Nintendo, and he was doing the translating. And they came to the studio and they went through each team and they addressed this team. And Mark Pacini, one of the lead game designers, came out of those things and he just said, he hates it all. Shigeru hates everything. And from those meetings, they scrapped 3 of them. So the action-adventure game called Action Adventure, loved working titles, was scrapped. The football game was scrapped, and the vehicle combat was scrapped. And they were left with Raven Blade, and they were left with Metroid Prime. And from there, Raven Blade actually was a heavy influence on Metroid Prime. It had a lot of good elements, and this is probably the selling point that Nintendo used to say, okay, this studio can probably do what we want. I've actually got a little trailer, a bit of kind of info on Raven Blade. This guy's got a really annoying voice, so just ignore it. And I won't watch through all of it because it's like 7
mysteries,
minutes.
I've talked about a lot of well-known game series.
But yeah.
Your Marios, your Zeldas, your Pokemons, and so on. And while we all enjoy learning things about the game franchises that we love, and while I certainly enjoy talking about those, there are a lot of games that aren't a part of these well-established franchises that hold so much potential but for whatever reason get canned. And because they're not well-known, they just kind of fade off into the depths of the internet just to be forgotten. Today I talk about one such game. It was a promising RPG for the GameCube that was unfortunately cancelled, and it was called Raven Blade. Now, Raven Blade was an RPG for the GameCube being developed by Retro Studios. Yes, Retro Studios. You've probably seen their work with titles such as Metroid Prime or Donkey Kong Country Returns for a more recent example. The title was initially titled Retro Studios RPG, though it was later changed to Ruin Blade and finally Raven Blade. Development started in 1999, and the game was originally to be a traditional turn-based RPG, but was later changed to be an action RPG instead. The title's development was a slow one, the studio spending a lot of time working out the problems with the game's battle system, as that's the most important factor to any game's experience. And it didn't help that they were working on 4 games in total at the time, one of which was to be a revival of Metroid, the game we now know as Metroid Prime. Nintendo saw, though, that it was a mistake to allow the company to work on so many games at once, so 2 of the games were cancelled in favor of developing Raven Blade and Metroid Prime. Those 2 games being a football simulator and a vehicle combat-based game. And considering I hate football and suck at driving, the loss of these 2 games doesn't really bother me that much. Despite the 2 titles being cancelled, though, problems would still persist as Nintendo was more interested in Metroid Prime than Raven Blade. So much so that a lot of the people who were working on Raven Blade were moved over to work on Metroid Prime instead, which, of course, slowed down Raven Blade's development even more. To top it off, Nintendo didn't like how long it was taking to create Raven Blade, and that if the title hadn't gone through a major improvement by July 24th, 2001, then they would cancel the project. Yep.
Alrighty, so from that little clip there, you can see the camera modes. They had working third-person cameras and a fairly solid, I'm assuming it was relatively solid battle system. So the same team that was working on that then moved over to Metroid Prime and continued working. This then came into play when Nintendo wanted it to be a first-person shooter. Because they had all of the third-person aspects in place from Raven Blade, they were the guys at Retro were fairly sure that they could get a third-person shooter running. But from Nintendo's experience with games like Jet Force Gemini, they knew that this was really difficult, and they didn't want Metroid to end up with a crappy fighting system. So they really pushed for the first-person display. And then another spanner in the works was the Morph Ball, which is an extremely iconic element of Metroid. They really struggled to get the Morph Ball to do to really feel right when you transform into the Morph Ball, going from a first-person view into the Morph Ball, and how do you drive the Morph Ball around in first-person view. So I'll just play a little bit of the gameplay. Where is it?
Hey guys, this is Snack Attack 8, and welcome back to Let's Play Metroid Prime. This is part.
So yeah, we're just looking at the transition between the morph ball and.
All right. Hopefully the scarabs. Oh yeah, of course they're gonna. But you know, I'm just gonna run through. Suicide run.
Camera. There you can see.
I like how it's like if you're running, she sort of does a running start and like rolls into it. Like here, I'll show that off. Like zoop.
Yeah. So this was one of the
there's
real
no
points
I don't
of
think there's
contention.
any real like single frame where it shows her turning into the morph ball. It's like a weird transition that.
Yeah. So in that little transition, that was a core element that Shigeru was pushing. And he is stated quoting, "If this doesn't happen, if you can't get the transition from first person to morph ball, you can't do Metroid. We're canning it." So this was one of the core elements in the design that had to be there. This was one of the auto pieces that the game wouldn't be Metroid without the morph ball. And so, as you can see, they ended up getting the morph ball working, and we have Metroid Prime and all the further games from there. The control system for Metroid used every single button on the controller. There was not a single button that wasn't used. And not only that, it didn't use the conventions that other first-person shooters released around the same time used, with Halo and similar first-person shooters that started adopting the two duals, like the dual analog sticks. The GameCube didn't actually have two analog sticks. The C stick is technically a directional pad with 8 directions. So it's an 8-gated stick, and it's only got the 2 states on/off on the axes. So they didn't want to use that, so they ended up turning that into the weapon selection. So at any time you can switch between the weapons, and instead they went for holding the R button to look around, so you could move forwards and you could rotate with the left analog stick, but if you wanted to look up and down or around the screen, you had to stop moving and move your camera up and down. To make sure that this fighting system actually worked, because you have to stop moving to actually attack an enemy, they then took the system that the Zelda games used, the lock-on system in Majora's Mask and Ocarina of Time, where you can lock onto an enemy and then strafe around while still looking at that enemy. And through that they were able to establish a flowing combat system that didn't require you to stop moving to still aim at the target. This also helped players to target weak spots, because the lock-on would lock onto the weak point on the unit. So also when they transferred the later games in the Corruption, when they transferred it onto the Wii with Metroid Prime Corruption, they were taken to Nintendo and given the Wiimote, and they looked at it and they've gone, it's got 2 buttons. And we have 6 million buttons and we still used every single button we had. How are we going to make a Metroid? And at the time they were still just very basic prototypes, and they were like, we might be able to do this if we can use... when they transferred it to the Wii, was able to transfer fairly well, and they then released the entire Metroid trilogy with the Wiimote controls as well. So you're able to move your screen up and down by pointing the Wiimote at the screen, which removed a lot of the issues that the limitations of the controller gave you. Alrighty. Oh, I've got Morph Ball there in the image. So back to the sound, as I mentioned before with Hip Tanaka, Kenji Yamamoto was the composer, and so we'll just listen to a couple of his songs and I'll point out a few things as they play. Yeah. Alrighty. So just have a listen into the background to the almost sound effect type sounds that make up the music. Aside from the drum beat that runs, there's no real musical instruments. There's just lots of blips and pops, sort of weird environmental echo sounds. And this was part of Hip Tanaka's motto with the earlier Metroids. And in this one, this is another one. Once again, it's got that drum beat, but it's also got a lot of just sound effects sort of sounds, not very melodic sort of sounds. They also give it a really eerie feel. And that's going to drive me insane, so...
Hypnotic.
Yeah. Yeah. And in the earlier games, they didn't even have the drum beat because they were working on the 8-bit system. They weren't even able to produce those drum beats. They only had kind of that eerie sound effects style of music. So yeah, Shigeru Miyamoto was the lead designer on Nintendo's side. This one was an interesting one for him because he generally doesn't make really serious games. Most of his games are fairly light-hearted. For example, like Mario and Zelda, they've always got a very childish sort of feel to them. But he was Yokoi's protege, and so he learnt all of his trade from Yokoi. So he was able to really carry through the vision from the earlier Metroid games. Then sound effects. Tommy Tallarico. This guy has done way too many games. He's credited in more than 300 games. And apparently he can't read music. I don't know how true that is, but...
How does he get work?
He does sound effects. So the interesting thing about this is Shigeru sent him the sound effects to make. So he'd give him a list of sound effects that he wanted, and they'd send back the finished sound effects. Generally, sound effects don't work this way. Generally, you design the images and the particle systems, whatever effects, and then sound effects are kind of tagged on later as, alright, make a sound effect that kind of will sound like this looks. Instead, Shigeru flipped this up on the other side, flipped this upside down. So he kind of went, alright, create me a sound effect, I need an ice gun. And so Tommy Tallarico and his crew at Tallarico Studios, I think it is, they sent back a list, like a list of several sound effects for each one that they were asked to produce. And then the studio would give the sound effects to the special effects team that then did the special effects, and they would make a effect that looked like the sound. So here, make this. Pew pew, you need to make an effect that looks like this sounds. Which is a really interesting way, and there's a reason that Shigeru Miyamoto is as well known as he is, because he's not afraid to do something different. Alright, back to the morph ball with the boost ball aspect that I mentioned before. One of the other designers in the team, one of the fairly high ups, Carl Deco, was a real fan of skateboarding, inline, all that sort of stuff. He loved playing Tony Hawk and Pro Skater and that sort of stuff. So throughout Metroid, you see these half pipes, and they implemented, as I mentioned, the speed boost where you couldn't run because they felt it was too difficult to control. They took the ball and put it into a half pipe, and from there they created this half pipe mechanism where you could go up and down and use the speed boost to get higher and higher, and then jump out and get to the top of the half pipe. Really cool mechanism. And you can see one there down in the corner there. This is a half pipe from inside the game. So you'd be able to run up here and jump in here, and then you'd have to use the speed boost to get up to the other side and collect the item. So there were a lot of items that were hidden at the top of these half pipes, that were only accessible once you got the speed boost, and could do these awesome tricks and do aerials in the half pipe, which was really cool. Now there were two concept designers that I mentioned for the art. Todd Keller did all the environments, and he did one or two characters, but primarily he worked on the environments. And so here's a couple of his designs. So this is his previous work, and this is in the game. So you can see how his designs have directly influenced the architecture of the game environment. And another thing to note, Metroid Prime doesn't have a single environment that's duplicated. Every single room is completely different, and it has completely different assets and aspects to its design. So yeah, they reuse areas, but they never reused the assets, so a room was very individual. This also helped the players to navigate the areas. And so here's another one of his designs. This is an actual area. This is the design of one of the environments. And once again, the same picture that I had before. So the other artist that I mentioned that did all of the character artwork was Android Jones. Now this guy is absolutely amazing, solely with technology. So he works on a Cintiq, and he does use other things, but he calls himself a technology evangelist. And so I've got a little video
There
here.
exists the potential to use technology in very powerful ways to catalyze and communicate and bring people together, and that will always exist. I think that it's definitely a double-edged sword. It's going to be what elevates us from the situation we're in, and it can also captivate and kind of capture us in a place. And so it's up to the individual on how they connect. At this point, there's really no turning back of where we are with technology. It's like a weapon, it's like a gun, it's like anything. It depends on how you use it. It's not going to happen for you. I don't think there's going to be any sort of new social internet platform that instantly makes people relate deeper to each other. It's about looking inside. And I think the more people can focus on content, a deeper content to your tweets or what's on your mind, like what's really on your mind at this moment, like what's really important. I think that as we progress in this reality, it definitely cuts through a lot of veils. We're learning a lot of what's not important anymore. Finding the ability to relate deeper to a lot of people. And the illusion can get thicker at the same time too. How much integrity do you really want to invest in your connection with people? I think personal connections are more valuable than they've ever been before.
That's Android Jones.
That's Android Jones.
Okay.
That's him when he looks a little more respectable. He generally is a bit more of a hippie.
Yeah, you showed me some of his earlier.
Hippie, yes, where he's
He was
just
drawing on the opera house.
doing random stuff.
Guerrilla
And
warfare.
Android Jones actually does a lot of live art. So he does a lot of work where he's got a dancer, and he will digitally draw an image on a projector with a dancer with sheets or something that then the projection picks up his artwork and influences it. He also does a lot to music. Yeah.
Sometimes has the Cintiq hanging off the side, like a messenger bird.
He
And
quite
then
often,
drawing
yeah, he'll quite often walk
events and
around.
stuff like
He'll quite often walk around with a Cintiq strapped to his hip and sort of wear it like a guitar, and he draws like this while music and whatever's
that.
happening.
Well rated.
Yeah.
Pointless.
It's quite amazing. I've actually got one here that'll show a
The
bit of
opera
that.
one.
So I wasn't gonna actually show this, but
He's like a robot artist, man.
yeah.
My name is Android Jones. I live in San
So
Francisco, California.
he
And
advertises
digital art
Coral Paint and
evangelist.
ZBrush.
To me, time
and a
is
lot of that
one of the
sort of
most
stuff.
valuable assets that I have. It's probably the most precious thing. The time that
I'm
I'm
pretty sure
able
this
to
one.
release
Yeah.
and really dive into the creative process are the times where I'm feeling that I'm making the most value out of the given time that I have.
He just draws over the top of everything. So yeah, you see him, that's a Cintiq on his hip that he just kind of draws on.
It's become such a natural form of how I explore my imagination, my creativity, that it's settled into almost like a second nature now. I'll dream and paint.
It was interesting because before I found these videos, I'd never seen him with like a jacket on and that sort of stuff. He was always just like t-shirt and shorts and a Cintiq strapped to his hip like permanently. So yeah, for some of the character designs, this is the Chozo. He probably didn't actually use the Stargate thing, but he would have definitely used a reference to Horus in this design. There's a lot of the bird, half man, fairly prominent in the early Metroid games as well. So you can see the original Metroid Chozo statue, and this is the ones that he designed for Metroid Prime. Yeah, I got one more. So this image here is one that he drew during a digital drawing lesson. And yeah, I may pull this up later and show you how he drew this, but he literally just grabs crap. Like, you can see hands here. You can see he used telephones here. He used speakers to just throws crap on top of everything, and from it he creates something, and it turns out like this. So yeah. And another one of his pieces of art. And yeah, he uses so much different things in his art. So his backgrounds are all kind of like a collage of different elements all thrown together. Yes, it's doily. And I got one more video here. No, these are like 2-minute sketches. So this one here is him talking on some of his inspiration.
To die a sacred death. When I was 11, I had a blood clot in my brain, and I went through major brain surgery. It basically kind of reformatted all of my possibilities and what I thought that reality was. It just, nothing's the same afterwards. If it wasn't for those moments of experiencing that sacred death through intention, now puts everything in perspective. It kind of lays it all out. You have this whole inventory of what you're about and what you're doing, and gives you a motivation for how to proceed forward. It made me realize that what an amazing opportunity it is to be alive, and it's not, we're not immortal. And there's a limited amount of time and bandwidth we have to do what we're here to do, and it definitely catapulted me as far as my ideas and my motivations to do as much as I could with the time that I have. Afterwards, it turned out I wouldn't trade it for anything in the world. It definitely was it's a huge part of the genesis of my identity. All of the art that I make is just as a reflection of circumstances and events that have happened to me. And I think I create the works, they evolve and unfold on their own. It's rare that I really have an idea or anything beyond a particular intention. I work a lot with music. I work a lot with a setting that I create. This show in particular is all done digitally. It's all made with a computer and a Wacom tablet. Things that inspire me with sunsets, falling in love, and beautiful music. Finding your inspirations of kind of a non-two-dimensional visual source, you're going to be able to push through a lot farther and really figure out what is it you want to say. I think a lot of art that I see out there is a lot of beautiful paintings, a lot of beautiful things, but there's opportunity for a lot more message to come through.
So, as you mentioned in that clip there, a lot of his influences come from very similar sources to H.R. Geiger, who we were looking at before. With H.R. Geiger had his view on the Eros and Thanatos, death and sex drive, and a lot of what Android Jones is inspired by are the same sort of things. He just has a different view on what those elements are. So while Geiger uses a lot of sexual images in his, Android Jones uses a lot of, most of his images you'll find skulls, and you'll find those elements of death, and you'll find those elements of sex and of love inside his pictures, but he just has a different way of sort of presenting it. So from that, he's also got a lot of the same sources for his motivation in his artwork. So yeah, so when he came to convert a lot of Geiger's work, he had a ample sort of background to bring his own feel to the same artwork. Another one that he used was the eyes. He had an entire range that focused very specifically on the eyes. So you can see here where the eyes are a real prominent aspect in the image. And in this, in Metroid, you can see the reflections of Samus's eyes when a flash happens in the environment, or when something happens, those eyes burn onto the screen, and you get this same feel of eyes, yourself looking back and looking into yourself, and also that eyes being the doorway to the soul. You kind of get that feel while playing the game, and so that's another influence where he had a lot of sway in that and how it worked. Kind of stepping away from the auteur side of it, this is the three suits that you get extra in Metroid Prime. Does anyone notice anything similar about these? There's absolutely nothing different about them. They're all exactly the same model. And this was due to time restraints. They wanted to design a new power suit for each suit, and they just didn't have the time. And so when Keller went, all right, we don't have time, he handed one of the artists the suit and goes, all right, you're good with textures, make me a new texture. Make this look different. And so we end up with the three suits. You've got the Varia, the Gravity, and the Phazon suit, all there, ready to go.
That's how you run a company.
And one of the final aspects with Metroid, because of the backtracking, because of the item collection, there's a lot of freedom in how you play through the game. And there's something called sequence breaking here. Sequence breaking is what happens when you do something out of sequence. You get to an area where you don't have the items to actually achieve, or supposed to have collected an item, but you haven't yet. What's his name? Let's find his name. The producer, Katsune Tanaka. Not Tanaka. Something like that. Yeah. He was actually fairly influential in the sequence breaking events. He was very specific that sequence breaking events had to be removed. And so he was very hard on Retro Studios to make sure that they went through all the levels and made sure that there was no sequence breaking events. Of course, they either severely underestimated the Metroid Prime fan base, or they just didn't didn't manage to remove all of them, which is fairly common. So obviously some of the sequence breaking events came through, and as you can see here, Metroid Prime is really, well, Metroid in general is really quite a prominent speedrun thing. It probably was one of the first to have competitions to see how fast you could get through the game. This was then emphasized by the reward at the end, which was influenced by how long it took you to complete the game. So the best time out there for beating Metroid is 1 hour. There's about 10 hours of gameplay in this game, and they were able to knock it down to 1. And completing the game with 100% items took an hour and a half. These guys are insane. So I've actually got
Oh, is that an hour? I thought that was
that's
yeah, I thought
1
that was-
hour 24 minutes.
That's a speed run.
That's a speed run for 100%, completing the game with every item. That's ridiculous. So I've got a little bit of a clip here that shows how these speedruns and really reveals what a sequence breaking event is. So just have a watch and see what this guy does.
Yeah.
They are awesome.
Failed. Precious seconds.
So here's a door that you shouldn't actually be able to get through. And of course, the classic bomb jump.
Always gotta remember to put in your blocking measures.
And as you can see, they didn't expect someone to go behind these doors, so they didn't actually have material on the back of it. It was just a plan.
Put a block of volume.
So this is the first boss. And it's taken him 2 minutes to get to the first boss.
No.
You're supposed to have to knock the boss down, turn the lights on, wait for the tentacles to retract, and then go in the pipe and bomb him.
Tons of fun.
goes the first boss. Just like that. And I'll just fast forward a bit through this until he grabs the item.
How long does level 1 usually take?
About an hour. And he's done it in 5 minutes. And then he grabs items. He's not supposed to be able to get up here because it's a, as you can see the rail there, it's an area that he's supposed to have spider ball before he can do this area. He's not supposed to get to.
So he can get speed, so that he can fly past that?
No, because the trigger was that door, which is a one-way gate. So yeah, he goes through and beats the next boss without ever doing any of the stuff. And he collects the artifact. So that's about an hour and a half to 2 hours worth of gameplay that they just skipped. So yeah, sequence breaking events are fairly important in the game that you intend people to do speedruns through. And so just before we finish off, as I mentioned earlier, that Metroid games have a very strong end that changes depending on what you get, and also the post credits, the Monk's reward. I'm just going to show you the final clip. Warning for spoilers if anyone's really worried.
What?
But yeah, there is not much story to this, so there's not much spoilers. So that enemy looks very similar to the Mother Brain that you versed in the earlier games. It was highly inspired by Mother Brain. This is a 100% game, so as per usual, Samus removes it. So you only achieve that ending if you achieve over 95% items. So you won't see Samus take off her helmet otherwise. And after all these lovely credits... Oh yes, take note, the reference to Gunpei Yokoi at the top of this section. Yeah. See ya. So yes, for those who wait through the entire credits, you get your final clip at the end. So yeah, as I said, there's roughly 10 hours of gameplay. This one was 9.5.
Wait, oh no.
And thus ends the first Metroid Prime.
That was worthy of 100%.
Yes, they're normally not very big, but they are a reward nonetheless. And that's the end of my presentation. Thanks for watching and listening.